Thank you for joining us for this lecture as part of our current exhibition, 1972 Fischer-Spassky, The Match, Its Origin and Influence by John Donaldson. He'll be sharing his unique perspective on Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky's upbringings and experiences on their way to the 1972 World Chess Championship. And despite a lot of the differences that they had, he's going to share how they had a lot of similar formative experiences. He's the author of over 40 books on chess, with his most recent effort being Bobby Fischer and His World. And so that's kind of like the formal biography, but he's also a great friend of the museum, one of our, I think, most prolific donors. So with that, I'll let you kind of take off with the lecture.
Well, thank you, Emily. As Emily mentioned, when one thinks of Bobby Fischer and one thinks of Boris Spassky, you think one was born in the Soviet Union, one was born in the United States. Especially, right out, they were born in the case of Spassky right before the Second World War, in the case of Fischer during the Second World War, and of course they grew up during the Cold War. So you kind of think that there really couldn't be that much that they would have in common besides chess. But in the course of this little talk, I hope to make a case that they actually had quite a bit in common. And when I'm finished, if you have any questions, I really, encourage you to ask them. So the first picture you see here is, of course, not from their formative years, but this is from 1966. And it's from a tournament that was held in Santa Monica, the Piatigorsky Cup. It was the second one. It was organized by Jacqueline Piatigorsky and her husband, the famous cellist Gregor Piatigorsky. And in this tournament, Boris Spassky was the victor, and Bobby Fischer finished second. And in the middle there is Mrs. P. So we're going to now go to Carmine Nigro. So in the case of Fischer, born in 1943, he only really started his chess career in 1950. And around that time, Joan bought a chess set from a local dime store shop, and she introduced him to the game, one of many he was playing at the time. But something about chess just really struck with him, so much so that his mother wrote a little postcard to Herman Helms, who's the chess editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and she asked if there might be a place where her young son could play. And he told her you should come to the Brooklyn Public Library. There's going to be a simultaneous exhibition, and it'll be given by a very famous player, Max Pavey, and you're going to meet a lot of the New York City chess community there. Bobby played in the exhibition, and as you would expect, he lost quite quickly, but he met this gentleman, Carmine Nigro, and he was the main force in Brooklyn chess, and he was a player who learned the game relatively late in life. He was almost 30 when he started to play. But he was very systematic, and he still reached a good level. He became an expert despite this late start. And so he taught Bobby, along with his son and other junior players, and from 1950 to approximately 1955, he would meet with Bobby every Saturday and Sunday, and he really instilled in Fischer the fundamentals of the game. So much so that many years later, when Fischer was asked if he ever had a chess teacher, most people thought it would be Jack Collins' name that would be mentioned. But it wasn't. He mentioned Nigro's. And I think the reason he did that was because he was starting from a very low level, and it was clear that there was a teacher-student relationship, and from all accounts, Fischer was extremely grateful for what he had done for him. I think he's charged Bobby like $1 for lessons, just to keep it on the, for 8-hour lessons, just to keep him honest, as he said. The timing was such that in 1956, Nigro moved to Florida, and about that same time, Fischer met up with Jack Collins. And this picture dates from that period where Collins and Fischer collaborated. And at this time, 1956 and 57, it was the great push forward for Bobby. And his mother, Regina, she was a really big promoter of his chess. she didn't play the game. She had no real experience with chess, but she did everything she could to give Bobby opportunities. And so she would send out these annual cards in the mid to late 1950s, and she would send them to local organizers and to chess officials, just to sort of keep in contact, if you will. And
you can see this postcard downstairs in the exhibition after the lecture. This is one of the artifacts that we have on view.
And the person that this postcard is being sent to is Jerry Spann. He was one of the most important presidents in the history of the U.S. Chess Federation. He was from Oklahoma, and he was a successful businessman, and he was extremely helpful in building up the USCF membership. Now, by the fall of 1956, Bobby was no longer an unknown player in the United States. He was invited to play in the Rosenwald tournament. It was sponsored by Lessing Rosenwald, who's from the famous family that associated with Sears Roebuck. And Rosenwald, he had this idea that in the years when there wasn't a U.S. championship, he would still sponsor a tournament, an important tournament. And so he was involved with organizing U.S. championships from the mid-50s to 1969, but he also put on some of these other tournaments. Bobby would not have qualified to play in the U.S. championship in the fall of 1956, but he was a 2,300 strength player, and as such, he got his invitation here. And if you look at that board, it's interesting how chess photos can tell a story. And what we can see in this photo is that Bobby's playing, and we can see the position on the board, that it's a 4 pawns attack in the King's Indian defense. And there's a database called ChessBase that has all the games from this tournament. And so we can find out that the person who's missing from this photo that's playing white but out of view is Arthur Bisguier. And while that might not seem like much, this was a big deal to Bisguier because he won this game. And then he drew the next game against Bobby, and then he lost the last 13 games they played. So for Arthur Bisguier, this is a very nice photo. And next to Bobby there is Sidney Bernstein, who's a strong American master. Now here we have Bobby a little bit later, about 9 months left since the last photo, and he's spectating here. He's looking down at a game played by Edmar Mednis, a fellow U.S. Chess Hall of Famer, and this was played in the spring of '57 and probably at the Manhattan Chess Club. And already by this point, Fischer was much markedly stronger than he was in the previous photo. You might think, because in 1956 in that Rosenwald, that he won the game of the century against Donald Byrne, that he was already amongst the very best players in the country, but that was really kind of a one-off. And it was only in the summer of 1957 that he would explode. And so this is right before his great leap forward. And this is right after his great leap forward. This is in May of 1958, and just previous to this, Bobby had appeared on the show I've Got a Secret, and of course his secret was he was the U.S. champion, and nobody had a clue. The idea that such a young boy could be U.S. champion was pretty much unthinkable for everybody in the audience. And this was really memorable for Bobby appearing on the show because he and his sister Joan both got tickets to go to Yugoslavia, where they would host the Interzonal. And you would think, well, he won the U.S. championship, surely it would be the responsibility of the U.S. Chess Federation to send him. But both Fischer and Pal Benko, who was also representing the United States in this tournament, they didn't have that chance to get the sort of support they deserved. The U.S. Chess Federation had maybe 3,000 or 4,000 members at the time, and they were just dirt poor. So if Bobby had not gone on the show, it's not clear that he would have been participating in the Interzonal. And along the way, he was able to make a stopover on his way to Belgrade in Moscow. And this is the only time that Bobby ever visited the Soviet Union in his entire life. And it was always his dream growing up to go to the place where all the best players in the world were from. And he had read Soviet chess literature, he had learned Russian expressly for this purpose, And so he was really, really excited. And of course, he was a little bit naive. He thought they would arrange matches where you get to play against all the good Soviet players for training. Their thought was like, why make this guy a better player? He's our competition coming up in the interzonal. So Bobby ended up spending most of his time playing blitz 5-minute chess at the Moscow Central Chess Club. And they tried to drag him off to go to the Bolshoi, go to art museums, go to the park. He would have none of it. He was very happy if they just give him a sleeping bag and he could just spend all his time at the Moscow Central Chess Club. And he's playing here against Vladimir Alatortsev, who was a strong Soviet international master at the time, later to be a GM, who also was the head of the Soviet Chess Federation. So, you know, this guy was like a major league commie, and Bobby's giving him a thrashing in this position. Now, we shift over, and now we have the young Boris Spassky. And one of the first things I can say that is, you know, a similarity between both Fischer and Spassky is they were both raised by their mother alone. And both of them experienced extreme poverty when they were young. In the case of Fischer, when he was born, it was in a home for unwed mothers in Chicago. His sister was actually sent to St. Louis to live with other family here. And for, I would say, until maybe the early 1950s, when Regina got her nursing job squared away in New York City, it was just kind of catch as catch can how they survived. She had taken jobs as like a welder, as a typist, as a teacher, and you know, whatever it took to keep the family going, she would do. And one thing that she had in common with Boris's mother is that they were both teachers. Boris's mother was a teacher all the time. Another thing that one can say about both the young Boris and Bobby is that their talent was spotted pretty early on. In the case of Spassky, it was captured much earlier. When he was 10 or 11 years old, he became the first professional player of the post-World War II generation. His coach at the time, Vladimir Zak, did a very, very important thing in arranging for him to get a stipend which allowed his family to move into a single apartment. In the Soviet Union, it wasn't necessarily how much money you had, but what connections you had. And so the state arranged for your lodgings, and in the period after World War II, you know, after the Soviet Union had really experienced profound destruction, it took a long time for things to get back to normal. And so for Spassky's family, he had two siblings, it would have been really tough sledding. But fortunately, Zach managed to arrange this pension, if you will, for Boris, and he also arranged coaching. And it was not long after that, in 1953, that Boris made his international breakthrough at the age of 16. And at that time, there were very few international tournaments, and there were very few opportunities for leading Soviet players because there were so many of them that most organizers would only want a handful in their tournament. And the result was that you could be a very, very strong player and never play outside of the Soviet Union. But an exception was made for Spassky, and he responded in this tournament in brilliant fashion. This is a very famous game he's playing against Vasily Smyslov, who at that time was probably already the #2 player in the world and would play for the title several times with Botvinnik in the following years. And in this particular game, Spassky defeated him using the Leningrad variation against the Nimzo Indian. This was a line that his trainer after Zach, Alexander Tolush, had perfected, and he passed on this knowledge to Spassky, who used it with great effect in this game. And so Spassky finished tied for 4th in this super strong tournament, and he earned the international master title straight away. Now Fischer, on the other hand, he started playing, as I mentioned, you know, casually in the early 1950s, but he only started playing in tournament chess in 1955. So if you compare the relative strength of Fischer and Spassky when they were 12 years old, Spassky would have just cleaned his clock. It wouldn't have been even close. But Bobby soon made up for it. And one of the ways he did it was playing against very strong opposition in New York City. There wasn't that much depth in American chess, but all the good players lived in New York. And in this particular case, you see him facing William Lombardi, who was a great talent in his own right, had won the 1957 World Junior Championship with a perfect score, something that has not been done before or since. Now here we have Tal and Spassky playing in the 1959 Soviet Championship in Tbilisi in present-day Georgia. And Tal and Spassky were born almost at the same time. Tal was born in the last part of 1936 and Spassky at the beginning of 1937. And initially, Spassky was the big talent. He was the one that represented the Soviet Union in the World Junior in 1955. And he was the one that everyone kind of marked as an up-and-comer, especially when he played in the candidates the following year in 1956. But he was completely, Tal was like a shining meteor. He just burst through and he won the 57 and 58 Soviet championships. And of course, as we all know, just a couple years later after that, he became world champion. And here they are playing in 59, and the previous Soviet championship, Tal had beaten Spassky in a critically important game. In the Soviet Union, they would have to play in the Soviet Championship and have a good result to qualify to play in the interzonal, for a chance to play in the candidates, for a chance to play for the World Championship. And if you stumbled at any point along that ladder, you had to wait another 3 years. And that's exactly what happened to Spassky. He lost the last round game to Tal, and as a result of that loss, he didn't qualify to play in the interzonal. So when Bobby played in 1958 in Porto Rose, Tal was there, but Spassky wasn't. And another thing that Spassky and Fischer both had in common as young people was they both had a real love of sports, but it took different forms. In Bobby's case, he was a die-hard baseball fan, and he played stickball in the streets of Brooklyn. It helped that he lived 6 blocks from Ebbets Field, and you know, he was a big Duke Snider fan. For any of you that are baseball fans, he loved his Dodgers, and like other people in Brooklyn, he cried when the Dodgers moved to Los Angeles. But he remembered the glory days of the Dodgers from the 1950s. Even when he was living in Iceland in the last part of his life, he watched some old games on YouTube. So here we have Spassky, and this photo I find really quite remarkable. You don't often see a world chess champion high jumping, and he did a pretty good job of it. Spassky was about roughly 5'10", and here he's clearing about 6'1", and that was his. You know, I mean, it wouldn't qualify him for the Olympic Games or anything, but I think it probably qualifies him as the world champion that jumped the highest over his height.
Yeah, I guess today you can see pictures of Magnus playing soccer and things like that, but that's different.
It's different, yes. But I will say this, later in life, both Bobby and Boris became very avid tennis players. And one thing I've always hoped for is that the two of them would have played tennis together. You know, that they would have moved their rivalry away from the chessboard to tennis. But there's no indication that actually ever happened. And it points out the fact that how much different chess is today than it was back in their time. Because today, when you get two leading players like, let's say, Magnus and Levon Aronian, during the course of their career, they've not just played dozens, but they probably played hundreds of times. And of course, some of those are at faster time controls, but still, even in classical chess, they would have played many, many, many times. Boris and Bobby, between their first meeting in Buenos Aires in 1960, which we'll see in a moment, and their match in 1972, they only played 5 times. So a much, much different world than today. Now here we have another picture of Boris, and here he's playing in the Chigorin Memorial held in Moscow, and the person that's presenting him with his prize, he tied for first with Bronstein and Smyslov, is Salo Flor. He was a great Czech grandmaster, potential world championship contender in the 1930s, but when his country got swallowed up by the Nazis, he decided he should move east to the Soviet Union. Can't say whether that was a good move or a bad move, but it kept him alive. And in this particular case, you can see in the front row right next to Spassky the young lady there is Bent Larsen's wife, Lizette, and then there's Bent Larsen in the middle, and there's Friedrich Olafsson on the right. And I mentioned there were very few tournaments back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. There were even fewer tournaments, international tournaments that is, in the Soviet Union, with the result that these tournaments tended to be ones where the local players, the Soviet players, would just crush all the foreign players, because the locals knew that there were very few opportunities that they were going to have, so they made the most of them. And the foreign players tended to be young, because after one or two extremely painful tournaments, they didn't want to accept any more invitations to go there, you know. And it didn't make sense for a professional. The currency was not convertible, food wasn't probably that great, but if you wanted good chess training, this was the place to go to. And now we come to Bobby's adulthood. In 1960, when Bobby was 17, his mother, Regina, decided to go on a peace march. That was a time when there was rising nuclear tensions, and you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was right in the neighborhood. And they, people like Regina, they didn't know what they could do to make a meaningful gesture to try to improve the climate. And so they decided they would go on this march for peace, and in doing so they would you know, generate a lot of publicity and get people thinking about the nuclear rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Regina was a person who talked the talk, but there's quite a few like that. But she also literally walked the walk, because she walked from San Francisco to New York City. And you can see in this photo at the top, there's the group of them walking along. And when they got to New York, then they went to, they flew to London, and then from London they walked down to Dover, and then they caught a ferry across to the continent. And then they just walked, you know, all through Western Europe into Eastern Europe, and then on to Soviet Union. So she was maybe not the easiest person to get along with. She's extremely bright, but she you have to respect the fact that she just didn't just talk. She did. And here we see her going back in time, 31 years. And I think some of you might be familiar with this institution. She grew up in St. Louis, and she graduated from Soldan High School at the age of 16 with honors. So clearly she was very bright. She would go on to learn 6 different languages. She became a medical doctor in her 50s. And if you look in the back row on the far right, that's Regina.
And did she go to the Washington U Med School at all?
No, she didn't. And you know, I think the thing is, at that time, it would have been very difficult for 3 reasons for her. One, because she was a woman, and there were very few female doctors at the time. The second reason I think it would have been difficult for her was she was Jewish, and there were quotas. I mean, I was just reading just in the newspaper recently, there were Ivy League schools had quotas, even, you know, in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And the third reason was she was poor, dirt poor. You know, so I think for all those 3 reasons, she had to forego her initial medical training, but that was always her dream, to be a doctor.
Oh, we've got about 15 minutes left.
Okay, so here you can see this is her award that she got for graduating from honors from high school at the age of 16. And now, this is going to be a tough one for you to see, but this is a 1950 census, and it's a testament to Regina's willingness to do whatever it took to put her kids in the best possible life. Because if you read it, it says Regina Fischer was born in Switzerland, which is true. She came to the United States in just a year or 2 after being born. And then it also says Bobby was born in Illinois. That's true too. And then, yes, and then it says that Joan was born in Moscow, which is true. But it says Moscow, Idaho. So that was a nice little maneuver on her part, because as we'll see, the family did spend time in Moscow, Idaho, but that's not where Joan was born. And here it is. Of course, you know, for a long time we didn't know who Bobby's father was, but now it's like 99.99% sure who it is. And in this particular case, what we know is that that Regina and Bobby's father, they both, Paul Nemenier, they both were incredibly brilliant, but they were also very strong-willed personalities. And so they never got married. You know, when the birth certificate for Bobby appeared, Hans Gerhard Fischer, who was Regina's former husband, he appeared on the birth certificate. In those days, it was very important that the child have a father listed on the form. And here you see Regina trying to begin her nursing studies. Again, at this point in time in the United States, her becoming a medical doctor would have been pretty much impossible. And now we move on back to the first meeting of Bobby and Boris. And you can see Boris is second to right on the far right there, and then second to the left on the bottom sitting is Bobby. And this, of course, is their famous game in the King's Gambit, where Boris beat him, and Bobby then analyzed the game to his bust of the King's Gambit. But as I was mentioning before, this is the first time they played, but they would only play 4 more times before they met in Reykjavik. Times were much more different then. But of course, before Bobby could challenge for the world title, he had to get past the standard bearer of American chess for so many decades, Sammy Reshevsky, a guy who's, you know, barely 5 feet tall, but, you know, could eat razor blades. You know, he was so tough, very intense competitor, and they played a match that was tied, and it was broken up in the middle. And although Bobby would later get the better of Sammy in individual tournament games, in the match play they were equal. And here we have another photo of Bobby in his early years. This was in Varna in Bulgaria, where they had the Chess Olympiad in 1962. And already by this point, Bobby had shed his you know, sweaters and his blue jeans for suits and ties, which would be his trademark for the rest of his career. And now we go to the Havana 66 Olympiad, which is the one of the times that Bobby and Boris met. They drew a game there with Bobby on the white side of a Briar Roy Lopez. And if you look at this table, you should be able to recognize it because it's downstairs on the first floor. It's the table they used at the Havana Olympiad. And if you look at this photo, Yasser and I know for sure will recognize one thing that can be done in this photo that couldn't be done now. And you'll see that the cigarette in Spassky's hand. You know, that, I mean, you can't believe that. You know, when I first joined the Tacoma Chess Club, it was like a Dutch cafe. You know, it was just the ceilings were yellow, and my parents were horrified. They thought I'd become a chain smoker overnight because, you know, clothing just reeking of smoke. So here we have Bobby and Boris. They played twice at the Piatigorsky Cup, but they didn't really spend that much time together. Boris, you know, had Tigran Petrosian playing the tournament that he could hang out with, and he had other friends he made in Los Angeles, like Anthony Sadie. But in the case of Bobby, he mostly kept to himself. So even though they were spending the better part of a month in Santa Monica, there wasn't that much interaction between them. But it did change at the end of the tournament. And you can tell sometimes from a photo that something's not quite right. Because in this photo, it shows White's knight on f3 and his White's pawn on g3. And yet Spassky and Fischer, when they played the second time, Bobby was on the white side of a martial attack. So how could this be? Well, it was just a staged photo after the round is how it could be. And if you look at Bobby smiling, you can kind of guess that. And here we have Bobby, the public speaker. All you have to do is go downstairs to the ground floor and listen to him on the Bob Hope Show to know that Bobby could be a really, really good public speaker, and all the accounts I've heard of his closing speech here at the Piatigorsky Cup were right on the mark. And here is again the photo we started the talk with, the two of them with the famous Piatigorsky Cup, which is part of the collection here at the World Chess Hall of Fame. And now we've got Spassky reaching the apex of his career. That he had a run from 64 to 69. Everybody remembers Fischer winning all the candidate matches with perfect scores, but Fischer would also have said that Spassky's achievement between 64 and 69, winning an interzonal, winning 6 candidates matches, and losing only to Petrosian by 12.5, 11.5 in 66, and then defeating him in 69 was really a special result. Spassky was an incredible player at this time. And here we have the last meeting prior to their meeting in Reykjavik. Spassky and Fischer are playing in the Siegen Olympiad in West Germany. This is a very famous game that Spassky won. Out of the 5 games they played before the match in 72, Spassky won 3 of them, and there were 2 draws. So he had real reason to be optimistic about his results. Of course, for Fischer, he just felt like he was a much stronger player in 71 and in 72 than he had been prior. And here we have one more photo. This is of Boris Spassky giving a simultaneous exhibition in the Soviet Union. Spassky was never a member of the Soviet Communist Party, and he was really very much his own man. And I think part of that is because of his family background. His grandfather was a Russian Orthodox priest, and his mother instilled with him a strong religious faith, something that wouldn't have been so common during the time of the Soviet Union. And in his later years, Spassky often referred to himself as a monarchist, that he was not a fan of the Soviet times, that he preferred more the times of the Tsar, and he did a lot of reading in Soviet and Russian history in his years in the 80s and 90s. And there we are.
Well, thank you for giving this talk. I feel like we could have even spent another hour picking your brain and getting all of your wonderful Fischer and Spassky knowledge. Does anyone in the crowd have any questions for John?
Absolutely. First of all, sorry I missed the first all today that are available after the Reykjavik match. And Boris was asked, well, you lost the match. How do you feel? He said, I lost to the better player, which is something you never hear from a world champion. That was the first one. The second thing was, they said, well, you're no longer the world champion. And he said, well, it was something like, it's okay. I had a lot of responsibilities when I was the world champion. It almost seemed like Spassky was relieved to give up the burden of the world championship. In your research, did you pick up on that, John?
Well, there was definitely a lessening in his quality of play after he won the title in 69. For example, he tied for first in 1971 in the Canadian Open in Vancouver. But if you look at the games that he played, I mean, he was really shaky. And, there were a couple of strong grandmasters like Kovalik and I believe Benko might have been playing there, Suttles was playing there, but it wasn't like a regular, international tournament that he would have played in Europe. So many years after the match in Reykjavik, he sent a postcard to the late Nathan Davinsky that's in the collection of the World Chess Hall of Fame. And in this correspondence between the two, he said that he realized after that tournament in Vancouver that he lost like one gear, that he was no longer playing quite at the same level that he had played at. And obviously still playing at a very high level, because even after he lost the match with Fischer, not too long after that he won the Soviet championship. But he felt that, and perhaps also it's kind of like you have this goal, you want to achieve this goal. It took both Fischer and Spassky 13 years for each of them after their first failure in the candidates, in the case of Spassky in 55 and Fischer in 59, I should say, to actually, storm the summit, if you will. And I think that that Spassky, probably, it's probably harder to defend your title than it is to win it. And I think if you look at like Botvinnik, it seemed like, from 1948 up until till Fischer, the only world champion, I believe, to actually defend his title on the first trot successfully was Petrosian when he beat Spassky. Botvinnik always got him in the revenge match. Right. So I think that there was definitely a sense of relief from Spassky. If not expressed, overtly, I think he still internalized that feeling.
Tony.
So I know that Bobby and Boris stayed in touch with each other after the 72 match. They again played in, was it 92, 93 in Yugoslavia?
1992.
92. Did Boris and Bobby stay in communication with each other casually? like apart from that match, did they communicate with each other, just share letters? Did they play correspondence?
They did, and they even did during that period in the 1980s. You know, from about 1972 to about 1979, Bobby was, if not, always in the public eye, he still was keeping in touch with close friends like Pal Benko and Svetozar Gligoric. But from like about 1979 or 1980 up until about the early 90s, he cut off communication with Benko, cut off communication with Gligoric, people who were lifelong friends, and he was just completely off the radar. But he did maintain some contact with Spassky, and of course by the late 80s, then he starts to, he visits Europe, and he starts to be, there's periodic sightings, but for a long period in the 1980s, Spassky was probably one of the few people that he actually kept in contact with. And I think that there really was a kinship between the two of them. And I think that, going back to what Yasser said about the 72 match, I think the one thing that Boris regretted was the third game. It really put him in a really awkward situation because Bobby, of course, he played in a room that was smaller than this room in that third game. And for somebody like Spassky, who's used to playing like in a stage with like 1,000 spectators, it must have been a suffocating atmosphere. And that was not a one-off by Fischer, because in the Taimanov match in Vancouver, they originally were going to play in one facility they both agreed to, but then the dean of University of British Columbia, he said, no, you can't play in that one. So then he started looking for another suitable site, and Fischer said, this is like a perfect place to play, and Taimanov's like, if you want to store your coat there, it's good, but otherwise it's not acceptable. So I think that's the one thing for Boris. I don't know that what would have happened if the match might not have come off if Boris had stuck to his guns and just said, we have to play in your playing hall.
Right.
And keep in mind, up to that point, the score was 2-0 for Spassky, and he had never lost a game against Bobby, and he lost that game miserably. So and then after that, Bobby's like, oh yeah, we can go back to the big room, we can play there. So, Spassky, I think Fischer, you could say in some ways owes Spassky a lot, but on the other hand, Spassky owes Fischer. That match in 1992 set up Spassky for life. And one of the really nice things that Spassky did, he was always a very thoughtful person, is when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and immediately there was privatization of all the properties. Spassky got in there and he bought like flats for all of his relatives, his siblings and cousins, and he also bought one for his old coach Vladimir Zak, from 40 years plus. He remembered Zak in his old age, and it was a very smart move because it wasn't terribly expensive then, but he knew how important it would be for these people to have a roof over their head, when things just went sideways in the Soviet Union in the 90s.
Well, if there are no other questions, we'll have some books available for purchase in the back. Thank you all for coming. You can learn more about our upcoming programming at worldchesshof.org, and we've got lots of fun Fischer and music events coming up.
Thank you, John.
Maybe a wonder has
The guy